Welcome everyone to the Game Dev Discussion Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Alex Beddoes. And this week we have Sony Santa Monica Senior Environment Artist, Melissa Smith on. Thank you so much for taking the time out.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's good practice for just speaking ad hoc and improvisationally, so I'm excited for it.
Everyone's got so used to work from home, like everyone's forgot how to speak, to communicate, to have conversation.
Yeah, I'm warning people anytime I see them in person, like, remember, we haven't had practice doing this in a while. So if someone says something kind of weird, ask them to clarify or just let it go. Probably a lot more let it go than anything. So
I guess starting with that, we were speaking off air quite a bit about remote work. I guess, how have you found it so far? Like, we're now, in the UK, I guess we've been locked down for on and off just over a year. Stuff is slowly starting to open back up here. How have you found it so far? Like, has it been jarring? Have you enjoyed it? Has it been frustrating, like, for you personally?
On some days it's very much no problem. We just kind of find a cadence and a rhythm and we knock out what we need to knock out. But anytime that there's a mismatch in communication or you're working on something, it seems very straightforward. You find something else out later that all those hiccups, pretty much derail you. They'll eat into your momentum, and you always wonder, you're like, is this a consequence of work from home, or would this have happened if we had been able to see each other in the studio? Would we have caught it sooner?
Yeah, it's been very it's been weird as someone as production artists, I guess. Like, it has felt like quite often you are just that sort of the cog machine. And we were saying off air, it's a lot of the magic in game dev and a lot of the interesting things happen in them tiny little conversations. Someone walks past your monitor and sees someone and you spark a conversation. Not even like artists, between designer and artist, or anybody. And you don't have that, and I don't know, it makes it all feel very robotic. It's the only way to describe it.
I think the robotic is a good term, because most people, we are actually not very good at adopting cameras at our studio, which is kind of surreal to me. So it's tough whenever someone messages you just with a chat, we were talking earlier too about things being, when you're talking in chat, it's a lot less efficient than talking in person. So you get to the meat, because it's very time consuming to talk to 5 different people about something that's kind of related, or go through the grapevine. So someone will message you, oh, you need to watch out for these two things jamming together. But I don't get the, hey, how are you doing? The connections, the magic, the human bond of like, hey, how are you doing? Did you know? Oh, I'm working on this. I also saw this. Like, there's an auxiliary conversation that happens in person that I think helps build team. And when you get a message just, hey, did you see this? It almost feels like it's an AI, it's an automated message. Like, I can't see the person behind it. I've never met them. I don't have a face. So I'm not sure how to digest it. Like, what's the priority on this? Or, who is this person? I'd like to know you. I'd like to know where it comes from.
Is another point which we spoke about, which I think is quite important, because it only really occurred to me when we were talking, which is the whole. Look, our colleagues. I don't know if it's the same for you. I treat my colleagues like my friends. Like, I have to. You work harder for your friends, and that's the way I've always viewed things. But it's very hard to look out for your friends during remote work. Like, you don't see when people are having bad days. You don't see when people are stressed. You don't see when people need somebody to ask if they're okay. And this is a part of remote work which hasn't really struck me until recently. Like, for the whole time, I've not really thought about it from that perspective. It's always been about workload, scheduling, the quality of the work going out. But now it's more, I'm thinking, okay, these are my friends, and I don't know if they're okay. I don't know when they're having a bad day. Like, they could be having the worst day in the world, and they put a smiley emoji, and you're like, oh, well, I guess they're okay.
Yeah, we have all these passive aggressive things that we do when we text message, like the haha and the LOL, even though there's no reason why there needs to be an LOL for every sentence. But I'm with you on the friends, and I think it is something that's really magic and unique about our industry. Like, how many other industries do you get to work with people that are so talented, creative, humble, curious, engaging? And so I think it's a huge loss to not be able to engage with them every day. And it's a lot of time, that we spend at work. So that's just been a huge luxury that I've tried really hard over these years not to take for granted, that not only is my work is hard, games are too hard to not get something out of it, right? And the friendships and the connections and the teamwork is something that is the trade-off to me. Everybody I work with, I definitely they're dear to me, and I care about them, and I fear that that definitely will become loosened as we strive on with work from home.
You think it's going to be a case of a lot of them work relationships? Whenever we do finally end up back in offices again, you always have to restart a lot of these relationships. Where it's like, okay, I literally have not seen you in a year. Yeah. Who are you again? It's like, what's changed over a year? Like, because you have to micro. I mean, also there's stuff like social media. I mean, there's a nightmare in the office when people come in and be like, "Hey, so you're doing this," and I'm like, "How do you know that? I haven't told you." Oh, someone on Facebook, your wife posted. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm doing that, and then you have these conversations. You could end up back in the office and be like, okay, what's happened in a year? And everybody's going to go through that process with all their colleagues. Yeah. It's going to be so surreal.
And I think it's weird, when I'm chatting with people, I update a handful. I can update like maybe 3 or 4 people a day on what's going on. And then somebody new comes in and I'm like, did I tell them about this? And you end up dismissing things assuming that they already know, because you feel a little bit repetitive. Whereas if you're in person, you can kind of more efficiently update 5 or 6 people, at the same time. So you're not feeling as repetitive as you've told the story over and over again, and what group of people were together when you told it. So I think that'll add back into our sanity when we can get back in person and start sharing stories live.
Have you, during lockdown, have you had to be quite, I guess, strict on maintaining some things that are present in offices? So that, in an office, we are used to coffee breaks. You go 5-10 minutes where you go get coffee with your friends, or like lunch where you actually go get lunch. How's that been during lockdown for you? Because I mean, I know on my side it's been, I just kind of sit in PC and it's a blur until later in the day. And the only disconnect I get is go for a walk, like walking the dogs. That's the disconnect from from work and home. How's that been on your side?
Yeah, I guess that goes back to kind of the yo-yos. On some weeks, I'm like, no, this is the week that I'm really going to commit to taking my lunch break, or like making sure I get a good workout in. And then other weeks, if I feel, like I'm behind, then all of that gets thrown out the window. But I think that may also be true when you're working in an office. You have good weeks and better weeks. And you always want to, there's no end to the work, and I don't say that in a bad way. It's like you want to make lots of stuff. So the more efficient you are, the more stuff you can jam in a level. So I guess you feel like you put a good amount in, and the next week you're like, oh, but I got inspired. I can do all this other stuff. So you want to put even more in.
There's one bit we haven't spoken about yet, which I'm curious to talk about, which is culture, team culture. Mm-hmm. Something which every studio strives for. It means many different things to many different studios. I guess to start this conversation off, like, do you feel does remote work kind of eliminate majority of work culture? Because I know for me, Counterplay is a fully remote studio. Work culture is something they're also a lot newer, so they're trying to develop it, but it feels like an uphill battle. It's work culture happens again in the conversations, the small interactions is where the culture is, not the big meetings where you have your studio head say, hey, so this is what we're doing going forward. It's like, that's not studio culture. So how have you found that from your perspective?
Yeah, it's also what we talk about, even when you're chatting, because we're all chatting so much more, all of our conversations are hyper efficient and they're focused on the work. Anything out of that feels really stressful and like a distraction. Whereas when you're in person, like, I don't think we have the same frustration of talking to people in person, because you're there face to face. So I think that with our studio has really tried hard to build a remote culture, but I feel that there's not a replacement for in-person communication. Mm-hmm. Like, we could have a Zoom meeting and a Zoom call, but everybody is now highly sensitive to Zoom fatigue. If it goes on more than an hour, or you have 2 or 3 during a week, you just like, it's draining. And I think it comes at a cost the next day. And so if you're on the other hand at a party, people that or a small group together, like at the studio, we had all sorts of things. There was a board game night and a Magic the Gathering night. There was a movie night. There was different things at the studio, like, because it was a physical space, could really easily facilitate. It doesn't take a lot of resources for them. But they're like, yeah, if you want to come and play board games on Tuesdays for an hour after work, like, cool. And that's a bit trickier to organize through Zoom or through online, because how do you broadcast the whole studio to play a board game and break it up and organize it? I guess if we were really to try and tackle this problem, we probably could, but I still think it would pale in comparison to sitting across a board with somebody you don't know, but you know is a peer of yours, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think crossing folks in the hall, what's magic about it is that there's very few places in real life where you can just pass somebody and know you have a lot in common with them. So if I'm going to like just pass this person that is in our studio, we probably can sync up on a whole lot of different topics. So it's like it's a safe space for making friends with strangers and practicing something that makes you feel part of a group and a crew, even though this person, you've never talked to them.
I guess for remote, what kind of things do you think does work? I mean, so like one of the things it's both a positive and negative. Like something I found is people leaving and coming. Like I don't know who's coming and going. Especially, I don't know if you've had to during remote, say goodbye to a colleague. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of like, I mean, bye. I don't. There's not that send off where again a lot of the camaraderie and the interactions are saying bye to somebody, and you working remote. It's very much felt like people come and go, and it's a blur. Mm-hmm. I don't know, like, oh, this person's here now, and I'm like, are they? Oh, okay, cool. This person's like, can I speak to so and so? He's not here anymore. Oh, is he not? Oh, okay. That's a shame. I like that guy. It's like, it's a very odd thing right now.
I think it's hard for people starting too. Like if they started a studio, you know, in real life, it's like the first day you just meet a blur of faces and it's kind of overwhelming, but also very exciting. It's new versus like starting remote. You like open up the chat program. And you're like, hi, I exist.
Yeah.
People go, okay. But that's it. That's the end. And people aren't sure like how to interact with you, what to go next. It's not like there's not the banter or camaraderie. It's just like, you know, player one has entered the room. Welcome.
Yeah.
Next. So I imagine it's really hard for them to actually feel welcome and feel connected to the team. They don't know who's a good person a friendly face, you know, who's the friendly person to go with. And it becomes overwhelming to reach out and engage to every new person that comes on because it does feel, like you said, like we probably have the same amount of people starting and leaving as we usually do, but it feels so much more because we don't have that connection.
I guess one thing I wanted to, this is a bit of a segue, is, I mean, you worked in Insomniac, you worked on Ratchet & Clank. I don't know many people off the top of my head who have worked on some of the best stylized games and the best realism. You worked on God of War, you worked on Ratchet & Clank. Both did a fantastic job. Like I said, I don't know many people who've done both kind of, I guess, styles at a high level. You know, I've seen people who like started off their careers doing like, you know, maybe working in mobile or indie or something stylized, and they move into AAA and they move into realism, or vice versa. They start off on like VR or something like that, and then they move into AAA and they go on like a realistic game. It's very rare I see some of the biggest AAA titles executed by the same artist. So I guess from your sort of the technical work side of it aside, for you, how difficult is it to do that, to transition? Like, is it just art, or is it, you know, was there a lot of ways you think you had to change in order for it to work? Like, what was that like?
I think one of my strengths is I've really doubled down on like some of the traditional stuff. So whenever I'm making art, I think a lot about, you know, the standard composition, hue, value, rhythm, and shape language. So whenever I'm trying to adapt to a new style, it's a matter of just figuring out the shapes. And so even in this game like God of War, it's realistic, but it has its own shape language, and it's a stylized shape language. So, or in some cases it is. And I think that all these things kind of give me a bag of tricks. So I didn't find it that difficult to transition from Ratchet to God of War. I think that the work on Ratchet actually gave me a huge bag of tricks to pull from, because it gives me a way to push the fantasy into the realism. So the thing with realism, I think it'd be harder to go the other way, because with realism, you have a lot of real world examples. So you can go and you can Google, you know, what does a rock look like? What does a rock look like with water and moss and all these things? There's tons of references that you can source. And there's a definitely a way that it looks right, definitely a way it looks wrong. with Stylized, there's not really that limitation, which can be either the best or the worst thing. It can make it very challenging, or it can make it very easy. You can design a shape, and no one is there to be like, shape looks wrong. It feels wrong, but it's not like you can't compare it to anything that exists. So there's a lot of freedom there. So I think that I bring that like freedom, and I bring that practice into pushing some of the realism things like into a fantasy realm. I'm not quite as locked or limited to designing what I can see, because I've gotten a lot of practice in designing and making shapes.
It's funny because God of War has now become my kind of cliche example for it, in the sense of, I feel like game art, like when I see realistic art, like, you know, photo scans, photogrammetry, anything when you're pushing hyperrealism, it always looks different too. Like if you look at a God of War, even The Last of Us, like there's subtle differences where there's an intentional stylization. I didn't think about this until like shamelessly recently, where I'm like, oh, that's why it feels like that. That's why when I'm playing through the game again, I'm actually playing through it again right now, and I'm like, the color palette stuff, they're picking a very specific color palette. I thought it was just full range. I thought it was just whatever realism is, and it's not. It's got a stylization to it. Same in design language and the sculpting and stuff. And I'm like, it's almost, I'm tempted with my mentees to start saying, hey, I know you want to do realism, maybe you should learn to do a little bit of stylized as well. Not because I want you to be a stylized artist, but understanding how to abstract shapes and do this kind of stylization is way more prominent in the industry than you probably think. If someone says, I want to work on Last of Us, understanding these principles might not be a bad thing.
I think that there's a huge strength to being able to do that, because like we have photogrammetry, but photogrammetry isn't as widely, like when it came out, you're like, oh, we're all going to be using it, but people aren't using it as widely as they thought that they would be, because in order to put a rock in your game, you now have to go find the exact rock that you want to put in the game.
Yeah.
So if you're able to design, like that's what we do all the time, is design the rocks, like we have our very specific, and I'm sure, I don't know if we're all picked on that, but like our rocks are very much stylized to our project. They're specific. You can't find, like there'll be rocks that they're based off of, this is the inspiration for this, but you still have to tweak them and tune them and make something new, remix it, right, in order to get something that still feels like realistic fantasy.
Yeah.
So I think that ability to design is really a good one. And I think it just does take time, like everything else, like everything good in art, like you have to just practice it. And so when we bring people on for students, most students are used to working from a concept, because they're told in the industry, you're going to get a concept. And maybe in other departments, that's pretty true. But in environment art, most of the time we get a mood piece. Here's an example of what this environment should feel like. And there may be a couple of things that you can pick out of there. But in general, you're supposed to extrapolate a whole kit, a whole world from that. So you do need to be able to design and come up with and fill in a lot of the shapes that aren't depicted in that. And so whenever I am able to mentor or bring people on, I will ramp them up in helping, create some shapes that they don't see. Like the first task, probably a straight up concept. But then the second pass, it's like, okay, so you kind of got a grasp of the pipeline. You understand the shape language. Now let's noodle on it. Let's take that and amp it up so you can practice designing something. And I'm there with paint overs and helping them out and making them feel like they can experiment, because it is a risk and it is kind of a scary thing to do if you don't have practice. But my goal is to get people to be able to critically think and solve problems and design beyond what they see in the image, because you're so much of a better collaborator and contributor when you can create and invent, right?
Yeah. I think one thing, you speak about students, and it's become more prominent to me now as I've spoken to you guys. This is kind of like a nice byproduct of the podcast, speaking to all of you guys in LA, Sony Santa Monica, and I spoke to a few Noida guys, and Insomniac and Respawn. Specifically you guys, I think you're one of the few studios left where like you are a generalist. You take care of materials, you take care of high polys, you take care of modeling, and it's proved to be a bit of not a roadblock, but it's been like, I speak to a student, I sit down with mentorship, okay, we do a career course, and it's like, oh, like I want to work in AAA. I'm like, okay, so like what sort of studios are you aiming for? like, oh, yeah, I really want to work on God of War. And I'm like, okay, like, what should I do? And I'm like, what's a nice way of saying everything? Like, bits of everything. Like, and it's kind of, in the rest of the industry, the majority, there's still a couple of outliers. I think like machine games are quite generalist, but they still have hard surface guys and weapons guys. But it's most studios have material artists, organic foliage artists, kind of hard surface people, the organic people, world builders, and that's the majority. I mean, speaking to the majority of Europe and a lot of the US studios I've spoken to, that's the majority. That's how they do things. You guys are, like I said, you're generalists. I mean, you speak to students. Because it's daunting, right? If I say to somebody who's like just looking at the industry, yeah, you got to try your hand at everything. It's like, oh shit, that's a lot. So, like, I guess as an artist in the studio, do you feel that? Can you feel that when you're in, when you speak to the wider community? Oh, we are very much our own special bag of tricks, and it's very hard I guess it's hard for the rest of the industry to understand sometimes.
I've worked at a bunch of studios at this point, and almost every single one of them I've been involved for like asset creation and world building and optimization to get the level to run. So perhaps unless it's an old school thing, at least going from studios in Texas to the ones here in LA, they really have needed people to wear a lot of hats. And I think it's a good idea to urge students to be broad, at least at that stage, because there are so many ways you could specialize from there. But it's kind of like, when you're in high school, they're like, try lots of things, because you don't know where you're going to fall into. You don't know where the opportunities are going to be. So if you're like, I guess some people do know and they're hyper focused, but most people are like, well, I'm not sure which way I want to go. There are a lot of avenues. So I think it's good to have like an awareness of what's above and what's below, what the choices even are. And then as you gain experience, start to specialize. So you can start to see where the opportunities are growing and where they're shrinking. Like say you really double down on a specific software, and then the industry moves. They completely change focus. It'd be good to have like just a broader understanding of just general principles that don't ever go away. So that way you can bring them and still be relevant as you go.
It's been quite funny. I show math. Principal artist at Naughty Dog, Matthew Jones, I show his portfolio for environment art anyway. I'm like, his portfolio tends to be, oh, these are the cool workflows I've made for environment art, and it's like, oh, this is a cool trim sheet, or like a good decal set, or a good set of like tilables or modular kits, and I'm kind of like, that's environment art. Environment art is not your one-to-one prop, and it's also not your portfolio of mat balls. Like, it's these ways you bring it all together. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I have a portfolio of mat balls because I find, technical side of art a little bit more therapeutic. At least I used to. I'm starting to fall in love with ZBrush again recently, but it's, I'm kind of like, that's environment art. Environment art is all of the little nuances coming together. And again, as I spoke to more of the experienced, mainly the LA crowd, just because it's been interesting talking to them recently, it's been bringing together like your one-off prop. It's not going to convince me you can do environment art, neither is your amazing mat ball or anything like that.
Well, I think the upside to being a journalist is that you can really push the boundaries of the hardware too. And that's something that I don't know if people really bring up. Like, so if I'm building a world, an environment, I'm working with my designer, I'm figuring out how many rooms are going to draw from this. I'm going to build my kit based on my limitations and my spec limitations. So if they tell me that like from here, you can see 7 different areas that you can go to, there's going to be 20 enemies and the area is really big, I can see a lot, I'm going to have to build my kit in a super efficient way. So everything probably is going to be kit bashing. We're using a lot of materials, like all of my props. I'll make a couple of tilers and then be clever in my modeling because I know that there are trade-offs to doing different things. If I outsource or I send out to a specialist to make me a bunch of one-off, each one of those is going to add to my kit. It's going to add a bunch of costs that I can't manage and I can't as efficiently use. So I think that's one trade-off to being a generalist, is that I know what's going in, I know how to manage it, I know what's easy to optimize and pick off and kick out, or where the priority should be. So, but if I'm a specialist, I'm doing my part and I'm going to advocate that this has to be this way to reach a certain fidelity. I can't compromise. Like, say I'm a texture artist, I can't reduce my textures. I made them to look like this. and then somebody else is taking your work and using it in a way that you didn't foresee. So I think the nice thing about being a generalist is that you can see the big picture. So you understand, okay, this material, I made it, but I'm not quite using it as leveraging it as much as I could. So maybe there's something similar I can swap that'll save me, a couple of draw calls here and there.
It's, it's very interesting because I definitely know that perspective of, I mean, I've made tilers in the past, like being a counterplane. It's like, that's not really how it's meant to be used. And the textual density is fucked, but you know what? Fine. Well, okay. And I think you having ownership of I've always found this interesting, the fact that you guys have such ownership over your spaces. Like, I guess I'm assuming. I mean, you thrive in it. You enjoy that. Is it hard? I imagine juniors or not even juniors, new people who join. Okay, you own this level and you're doing everything. Have at it. It could probably be daunting to people. I mean, how is it? Something that is it easy to adjust to? Do you think? Like, how did you adjust to it? You seem to enjoy it.
I love it. Yeah. At this point, if someone were to be like, Melissa, make this 1-to-1, blah, blah, blah thing, you have no influence, I would probably have a hard time. Be like, but what am I bringing to the picture? You want me to do it. Clearly, you want me to, do it in a certain way or my way. Otherwise, why have me do it? But when people come on, I think that's the trick with them being remote. It's harder to assume what they do or don't know. So I think people live in limbo, just trying to make a thing. Whereas when you're in the studio, you can see all the different levels that people are working on. You can see the quality bar. You can see where people are at and the stages of like, how did you get it from, block mesh to where you're at now? You don't have that visibility working from home. And the other thing we do to help guide people up is we don't send them like, here's a huge arena where you're fighting a bunch of stuff, like day one, go. Like, we'll ramp you up. There'll be a straightforward task and then maybe a little more ambiguous task after that. And then eventually when you get a good handle of like the pipeline, you'll get a small area to work in where you're probably not starting building up the whole new kit. We have the more people who've been there a lot longer establishing ground zero, in this area, these are what the trees look like. This is what the rocks look like. And so you'll come in and assemble it in a way. And as you get more experience, you get a little more autonomy. So yeah, when you start off, you don't have to worry about being like, here, make this whole new thing from scratch. See you in 6 months. Bye. That's something that you'll ramp up into.
I guess with that, you meant you obviously do a lot of mentoring. I mean, most seniors and most studios do. There's some element of mentoring. How much can you do because of how inefficient mentoring is remote? It sucks so bad. Like you have to get the person in a call. You have to. I mean, I assume most of it will happen via a voice conversation. But how much of that gets lost? Because again, like one of the things is very interesting to observe. If you see a student who's like really good, like they're a good student, and they get a job at a AAA studio. You come back in 6 months and they have skyrocketed in terms of like progression because that studio, they've just absorbed so much information and people mentoring them and helping them. Again, how much of that do you think falls through the cracks remote? Because, one way I learned early on was I used to just eavesdrop on people and just listen to conversations and then like I've insert myself into the conversation to try and find out more. Can't do that remote. My lead couldn't look over my shoulder and be like, oh, he's struggling. Okay, maybe you know what, Alex, you're trying to do this thing. If you did, and then he mentors me. That's not happening now. So how much of it? Because you have to go out your way. Basically, there is no way for it to happen organically. You have to go out your way. So does a lot fall through the cracks, or are you able to actually schedule a set time aside in your head to consciously go check on a person? Not because they need checking on, just because I want to do my duty as a someone.
You want your team to succeed. Like your game is only as good as like the some of the everything needs to be cohesive, right? Yes. Everything needs to hit a certain level. So it's funny. I think if you asked every artist on Santa Monica, how do they do their work, and then what are they doing as a daily process, we probably answer super differently. But something that I'm doing because I still care deeply that people feel like they're working with other human beings. I have a morning sync with the people working with me. And on Friday, we have a cross-departmental sync too, which has been really illuminating because it helps us. Like, there's so many things that you're like, oh, that was very important. I'm really glad we have this meeting. Otherwise, I don't know if we would have crossed. I would have found that out. But I have a morning sync, and I do find it important to have the downtime where we do just kind of chat a little bit. How was your weekend? What did you do? Or are you excited about stuff? Because what I never want it to feel like is I'm the policeman coming in, checking in, like I don't want it to feel like something that builds anxiety, because it could be like, okay, what are you working on? Okay, what are you working on? Okay, bye. Like that could make people very nervous that they have to dog and pony or perform for me, So we get on, and I try and speed them up a little bit by explaining my thought process on things. And there are times, when we start something, these tasks are really colossal. Where do you start? What am I thinking? I have to just start somewhere, try something. And I like to share the journey with them on that, because a lot of times I'm quite honest. I'm like, I'm not sure where this is going, but I want to try this. And the next day, okay, well, it didn't quite go where I want to go. You can see the progress day to day, where I pivoted, where I decided that this was really worth pushing, or something that's like, okay, this is something that's in a back corner. No one's going to see it, so it's okay to lay it where it is. So I try and share my experience to speed them up, so that my experiences are their experiences, and also make them comfortable, not feeling like they have to know everything, and I think that's something that junior artists stress out about. Maybe even some senior artists, is this feeling that you have to be all knowing, all seeing, and have a clear plan at every single moment, but have the perfect, have everything be laid out perfectly before you start. But I think that there's a lot of magic to kind of making an outline and going from there and leaving it loose to be inspired, to learn something new along the line and have room to go back into things that you passed on before. To be honest, to be like, I'm not sure what I'm doing here yet, so I'm going to move on. I'm working over here. That might inform something that I'm working on, go back to that. So that's something I do think onboarding and ramping up and getting people going. I'm not sure how other people are picking out the potholes and making sure that people feel supported and that they're going to be okay. If they take a risk and it may not be the right line, like I'm there, I see it every day. So if something's, I'll let them try. If it's not going in the right direction, I'll be like, no problem. I'll just do a little paint over and help unlock you that way. So yeah,
it's a weird one as well, because you kind of, I mean, I know from my point of view, I try to, like I said, you kind of set an example in the sense of, oh, I was trying this thing, and it's like you almost, what's the word? Not you kind of really lean into owning something, owning your mistakes. You kind of really, okay, this didn't work. I am fine with this not working, and we will figure it out. And you kind of like, not exaggerate, but you kind of like, this is fine. this is a perfectly good thing. And everyone else is like, oh, cool. Yeah, and everyone else is like, oh, okay, like, cool. He didn't get his head bitten off. All right, I guess it's not so bad making mistakes. You kind of, you use yourself as a scapegoat almost to be like, look, this is okay. This is perfectly normal.
As long as I'm not adding to anybody else's scope or someone down the line, or breaking the build, like there are a bunch of things that are just like happy accidents can come out of it as well. So it's just like the ambiguity is, and being agile, adaptable, I think is key.
Since we're talking about team, there's one thing we were talking about, your garage plan. So when you were telling me about this, you can explain in a second. I love it. I'm like, it just gives you such a retro vibe. So like, just talk through what you explained to me about the garage plan, because I think it's fucking great. I love it.
Yeah, so we're lucky enough to have a 2-car garage with the air conditioning unit. And I was sitting there like, with the specter of, even at the best case scenario, it'll still be a few more months of work from home. And nearly entirety of our bubble has been vaccinated at this point. So to expedite it and help us reach, we're getting to a very exciting point in the game where we can still, we can do a whole bunch of stuff, and like it's the kinetic things that we're missing. So I'm like, how can I start to bring some of that in? And so I'm like, well, I have this space, we park our cars on the street. I think I could fit like 5 or 6 people in there. So we'll see this summer if we can put together a little retro garage studio, our interim studio, and so we can actually get back to the big banana or whatever. So
it's whenever I see the war, it just got me thinking of like, when you hear war stories, that YouTube channel for like the game dev in like the 90s, And like I said, like there's a group of people who are friends who just collaborate in some dude's garage or some small office space, and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
God, you just get that vibe so much because also people who are there want to be there, and like,
Yeah.
it's somewhat jealous only because you're never gonna. It's so hard to get that in this industry these days, like especially on like big projects. That kind of tightness with your team, you're not gonna get that really. So like that idea, I think is amazing.
I wish I had it sooner because we this whole summer we're like, well, it's days, but even in our little closed pod, most of them, the people that are included in it, they've been living alone, so it's like probably would have been okay. But now for sure going to be okay. So I'm really looking forward to it, and maybe it'll end up being something we don't want to leave. They'll be like, we're going to go back to the studio, and we're like, our little nook.
It's
probably not. But.
I think that's one thing which I think is going to be very interesting for studios going forward. It's kind of like learning from this, I guess. Like, I mean, I know I've learned a lot about myself. Actually, another point which we'll talk about off air, which is it's kind of this whole experience has enlightened me to. I'm quite extroverted. And we always say to introverts, you need to talk more, you need to open your mouth in the meetings, and like, this is very important for you to do. And I never really had any perspective to it because I always used to say, well, just talk more. It's not hard. Like, I talk all the time. This lockdown has been, because you kind of ask an introvert to like widen their range of skills, right? Like, okay, you need to learn these other extrovert skills. I'm not saying you have to become an extrovert, but learning the skills is important. This lockdown, the script's been flipped, and it's like, oh, I need to learn to be alone. I need to learn to work on my own and not need like hustle and bustle and all this sort of stuff going on around me. I think it'd be very interesting to see how that then comes back to studio life and how studios learn from it, because like I said, I've learned a lot on just an independent level, like for myself. There's probably going to be a ton of stuff that the studios will learn. Is there anything from remote life that you think like, oh, this element, there's obvious stuff like, oh, like, flexible hours, or like, not flexible hours, sorry, flexi days, some days being able to work from home and stuff like that, which is, that's kind of like the ideal. Is there anything from remote which you're like, oh, this is enlightened us to this gap in our workflow or the way we communicate or the way we do things, do you think?
Yeah, I do think that the studio can be quite distracting for a lot of people. But I think that studio connection and that daily interaction with people is important because it's really hard to communicate with people. It's really hard to successfully work on a team and solve problems with people that disagree with you. And all these things take practice. And so I think if we continue to do remote and play into these things that are hard, we just don't want to do them anymore, we'll lose the ability to be able to communicate and to collaborate. So what I think probably a good flexible way would be to have core hours, so set some hours like 1 to 4, we need to be in the studio probably every day. You could do some work, sync with people, get your meetings out of the way, and then post that, go home and do the core, like, work before or whatever, like we'll figure out the hours, I guess, and do your core work. So you get that in-person time, and then you also get that focus time.
What's LA like in terms of, so like, there's rush hours, there's, the early morning block and the end of the day block, there's obviously it's rush hour. During the day, just out of curiosity, does traffic taper off in LA? Or is it always busy?
I think it's always busy, but it does taper off. there are bad times and worse times to travel in LA. So you figure it out. But I guess people could, depending on where they live, figure that out for themselves and like get their core hours as long as they're overlapping with their teammates. Because I think if you did like certain days at home and certain days in the office, you would miss out on people just may not respond to you online, So You'd be like, oh, I need a question. You have to wait 3 days for your designer to get back to you because they didn't see it because they have so many pop-up windows or whatever.
It's interesting actually, because it could, that idea of core hours and like you either work, like you do your like isolated work before or after, you always get a load of time back. 'Cause I mean, I know in the UK, like I can add an hour onto my journey each way, depending on what time of the day I'm traveling. If it's like, oh, I get to, you're going to come in at, I don't know, whatever, you said between 1 and 4, just for argument's sake, I'm just, it's random numbers, but it's like 1 o'clock, traffic's going to be pretty good. I'm going to be able to get into the office in a way quicker time. I'm going to have to get home in a way quicker time. And I get, it's. I had actually thought about it from a perspective of like split days. I actually quite like it. It's I didn't think of it like that. That's actually really, that you should be. So if Sony's listening, you should definitely listen. This is because I just thought the bit I like is it's that saving time in commute, because commute's the one which kills a lot of people. Like I used to do hour and a half commute each way at an old studio, and it is rough. And I know a lot of people do that, and it is 3 hours a day gone. If you could turn that into 20 minutes each way or half an hour each way, the quality of life goes up a lot, because a lot of stress comes from commuting. Commuting drains you. So
I had horrible commutes from Santa Monica to Irvine, which is an hour and a half. I did that for 9 months, and then I did after that Santa Monica to Burbank, which is an hour. So definitely I've been there and done that, and so now I'm like prioritize. I live very close to the studio now, but I want to circle back to the introvert discussion too.
Yeah, sure.
And I think it's labels are very interesting. They help us organize, some things about us. But then I'm concerned that by labeling yourself introvert or extrovert, you put a box around yourself and you don't do the discipline, the work at finding balance. Because I think that if people are both extremes, introverts and extroverts, and there's nobody in the middle on that spectrum, it's very hard to find consensus, and it makes it even more difficult to work with people. So I feel like on both ends, everybody needs to kind of find a way to find equilibrium. Like introverts, I was telling you, I used to be super duper shy. Like I graduated college, I didn't know one person in the industry. It was a small cohort, so we were all kind of like left out there in the void. And I realized I better start, introducing myself to people, because people do want to work on a team where people can communicate quite well to solve these chunky, meaty problems that, because we're always innovating. It's not like we could kind of write the box, rinse and repeat, do the same thing again. No, every project, the technology changes on you. The things that you're trying to achieve change on you. So since the nature of the industry is very innovative, we're always going to need to collaborate and work together. So that's why we need to find people that are good at communicating, want to work on a team. And even though I was very introverted, I feel like I had a lot to contribute. And so I fumbled my way through learning how to speak to people and introducing myself. And it was really weird. And I'm sure I burnt a bunch of bridges, because there's like this weirdo, creepy person being like, hi, do you want to meet me? I don't know a whole bunch of stuff yet, but I'd like to, it's so weird at first, and it's uncomfortable and awkward. And, but you get better at it with practice, and you learn to express yourself, even though it's very uncomfortable. And so I just worry these labels are like, oh, I'm an introvert, I don't want to deal with it. It gives me permission to not voice my opinion, not speak up on things that matter. And I think we all need to just practice getting better at vocalizing what we want, out of things.
Well, it's like I said, it's not a on and off switch. You're not either one or the other. It's a spectrum. I mean, I think the middle term, I've heard it said is ambiverts. And at first I hated that, because I was like, oh god, this is another label. But it's like if it is a middle, like I say, it's a middle point. If you're like on one end of that spectrum of either extrovert or introvert, it's like you don't want to widen how much space you take up on that spectrum to just inch yourself a little bit closer to the middle. Because there are, and there's something. It goes both ways. Like I'm a very very extrovert person, and it's like the thing I have to learn is, okay, either stop loving the sound of your own voice, or like help other people enter the conversation. Because like I said, there's people I work with who have loads of great ideas. One to one, they're great. They talk a lot, and it's amazing. We get into a meeting, and it's like it's the same. It's like the same few people who put their hand up and say something, and it's like, okay, like since we are them characters, it's like, okay, I need to learn to make room. I guess to make space. I guess is the best way to word it. It's like make space for them people to fill it, and then it's on them to be willing to fill that space. It's like this give and take. You're right. Like you kind of you fall into your category. Like I said, I will talk all day, and if no one tells me to shut up, I'll just keep talking.
And I'm really grateful for my transition, I think, too, because I realize it is a skill, and it is something that you have to work on constantly. It's not like it does get easier, but if you stop working on it, it's very uncomfortable again. But it helps me be empathetic to the people who are introverted in the room. So if somebody hasn't spoken up, I do pay attention and I notice, and I'll try and I know that they have something good to contribute. They're thinking it and they're like, these idiots, why don't they just blank? So if somebody hasn't spoken up for a little while, finding a way to make them feel supported, but invite them to the conversation. Oh, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this? I know you're an expert in blank. Or like you said, we were talking about this earlier. I thought that was a really cool idea. Do you want to go into it here? Is that something you're interested in? Or do you want to talk about offline? Just, paying attention, reading the room, figuring out how to get a more egalitarian conversation going, because I think that introverts need the invitation, but they're not always going to get it. So they also need to practice stepping up, and doing it without the invitation. So there's a balance. Like hopefully you have advocates in the room, but if that's not the case, which in my experience, it really hasn't been, just figuring out how to say your piece, how to give your slice of the pie.
It is a weird thing as well, because for example, my friendship group, who I spend most days talking to, like a group of 6 or 7 of us, we are all very loud voices. We are all very dominant voices, and we've learned to read the gaps in conversations to be able to put our point in. And that's great for us, like in a sense of in that little closed group, it's great. We can have them conversations and it's constant, nonstop, and we all have something to say. The funny thing is I hang out on a lot of Discords. If I move into a different Discord, and I hang out to speak to some different people, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can't talk. Like it's because it's very made me far more aware of it. You jump into a different Discord and you're like, okay, I can't talk like I usually do because otherwise I'll just dominate this conversation. And it's like, oh, okay, is seeing that bouncing between my group chat to like just general communities. I'm kind of realizing, okay, not everyone can do this. Not everyone wants to do this. Actually, that's a point as well. If you, with this conversation, whenever we speak about this, I know like I've spoken to people who consider themselves introverted and they feel like, oh, it's always us who have to be bad. It's never the other side of the coin. Have you encountered when you're mentoring or supporting people the pushback against the idea of, I don't need to change, this needs to change instead? Like, do you get much pushback to the idea of, oh, you need to like widen your bag of tricks?
Right. Where's the balance in there, and who says what you want to work on? I haven't had that too much, because I think that when we're working with people, we've been lucky to kind of figure out who we think we'll drive with. And for me, I like open-minded problem solvers. Like, probably that's like the biggest thing for me, is I like people who are comfortable trying something. They're not so rigid that they're not going to try. But we might have a handful. I don't think we really have that issue. I guess maybe there's a lot of buy-in to what we're working on. Everyone can see the bigger picture and the impact of it. And so everyone's just gung-ho to work on, something like we're working on. So
we also, it's Sony Santa Monica, so you are going to be surrounded by like the, some of the best and the people that you have to work very hard to get there. You don't end up at that caliber studio by accident. So I guess most people who are there, whichever side of the spectrum they land on, have to be at least somewhat willing to change and get better. Because like I said, you don't get there by accident. On it though, like I guess with that transition, like from trying to go from being quite introverted to extroverted, was there any times like you felt like there was a stumbling block? Only reason I ask is because I imagine there's probably a lot of people in their head who are like, oh, I need to do that, I need to go take that journey. And if something goes wrong or something backfires, they might beat themselves up about it. So during that process of you trying to speak more and introduce yourself more and stuff like that, do you think of any examples where like it might backfire on you or you were really uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think I'm still practicing it. It's something that I don't think you ever master, because culture changes on you constantly, and it always has and it always will. And so certain things that are demanded at certain points change. And so some cases they're like, okay, speak up, voice your opinion. And you're like, let me do it. And then everyone's like, that was a zig when everyone's zagging, and you're just now a distraction. So you have to practice constantly, like, what's the right tone for me to deliver this feedback? Because it's different for different people. It's different for different groups that you're working with. And a lot of times if you haven't had a lot of exposure to the room, like you're talking about in Discord, right? You're just getting exposure to the how are these people working? You don't want to come in there and throw a wrench in it. So it takes a little bit of observing, okay, reading it, okay, they're talking in this way, I'm gonna go along and try. But without context, it's very difficult to do that. And definitely I tried and I still try, and I was like, it didn't quite go the way that I wanted, and I kind of irritated those people a little bit. But hopefully everybody is forgiving, right? And they know that you're trying, that everybody knows that you're on the same team and that your intentions are the best for the group. You know, I do hear people sometimes will complain like, oh, that guy did this to me. And why would like, well, probably it was an oversight, you know, or a mistake or a miscommunication. And I would assume all of those things before I would assume anybody aggressively did anything against you.
Yeah.
So reaching out to them. So I really hope that if I come across and say something and someone took it as aggressive, which I don't know if that would be the case, but that they would want clarification, that they'd say, oh, what did you mean by that? And oh, no problem. Or that was something really silly. I said it definitely didn't mean it like that. So it's practice.
That's very true. There's another thing with that as well, which is, I guess, that idea of like, you know, you said sometimes you want to zig and everyone else is zagging. I don't even put that down to like introversion, extroversion. I mean, I'm very comfortable being the dumbest guy in the room. I'm actually probably happiest when I'm the dumbest guy in the room. It's like, oh, okay, I think this. Oh no, you've completely misunderstood. We go this way. And I just go, oh, okay, fair enough. And I'm like I don't take myself very seriously. I mean, look at the fucking shirts I wear. But it is, I feel like, not a skill, but it's something to be very aware of. You know, I guess not take yourself too seriously is not the right way of phrasing it, but
not
being
so
wrong
fragile
is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think to expect perfection out of everybody, you know, like it's just not true. It's not realistic. And everybody definitely is human, and you're doing the best you can with the information that you have. But sometimes you don't have all the information, and it does make me, that's the one thing that like drives me nuts. I'm like, I want to know everything so that way I can make the best decisions. But oftentimes you don't. So you have to go forward. You just have to pick a direction and go, and then be agile, you know. And I think that's where the humility comes in, and it's huge for being like, okay, I was wrong. That's fine. I'm not gonna sulk on it. I'm just gonna move on what I can do, and probably, hopefully, let people know, oh, I tried this, it didn't work. Don't try that, you know. Or if you want to try it differently. We learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, because I guess you also it's a position where if you say something wrong and you like, there's something which my wife works in NHS, the National Health Service, and it's basically the surgeon will say, here's the surgery we're doing, and he discloses it, and everyone in the room has the opportunity to say, you know, no, that's not the right thing. And although it seems arbitrary and stupid, like why would the person in the corner whose job is to, I don't know, keep notes, why would they speak up or say anything? But like the reason they have that in is because there was a time when basically the surgeon there's a surgery he was doing, it was the wrong one, completely wrong one, and everyone in the room knew that was the wrong surgery except for the surgeon, because he was the authority. Everyone's just sort of going, well, I assume he's knowing what he's doing the right thing, and I don't want to be the idiot who like says the wrong thing. But because no one did, that surgery went ahead, a huge thing. And now it's this big thing where every time they're about to enter a surgery, he says the surgery, and everyone says, yes, that is the correct surgery. And if anyone disagrees, they check the notes and they go through and they check it. And it's like, it's that thing. Is people being okay with, you know what, I think this might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, it doesn't matter, because it's just a learning opportunity, or even just I'm just double checking, and it doesn't really hurt.
Down to communication, which is like something that is, you know, fundamental to everything, and work from home and being in the office. It's hard on both ends, but I think that the work from home, it's like no one's doing those little checks, like what's working. So you find out things like later, and that does happen in the studio, but I think it's happening a lot more work from home, and people just aren't aware of it because they don't have the visibility. So communication is big. Humility is big.
Well, it's actually being in a studio as well. It's far more obvious you're pushing boundaries and trying to do things. Like, you can't do anything perfect. In game dev, most of the time you're pushing something new and trying something new. No one is just regurgitating. Even you guys between God of War 1 and God of War and Ragnarok, it's like, new generation. In a few years, we're going to do things differently. We've got new pipelines or whatever. It's like, I don't see that. And therefore, if we come back to the remote thing, you feel like this conveyor belt of work where you sort of churn and churn and churn. I don't see the big picture that everyone is trying new things and pushing boundaries. So therefore, every mistake feels like a very personal mistake that I've fucked up the conveyor belt, rather than, oh, I tried to push a boundary and I went in the wrong direction and I need to pivot and go this way. You don't see everybody doing that, so you're just kind of like, my conveyor belt broke and I fucked it up and this is my fault.
Dead end. Yeah. Whereas in the studio, we can learn from all of our mistakes. Like, someone's like, oh, I'm crashing for this reason. And then some people will be like, oh, I had that. You just click on that. No problem. You're like, oh, okay, cool. So.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I'm praying God remote works over soon. But Melissa, I mean, I say I sound like a broken record. We've been going for nearly an hour. I mean, it feels like we could talk for another hour quite comfortably, and it's gone very quick. I've enjoyed this. This has been very good because it's not very often you get to talk about, when we talk about soft skills or culture or anything like that, it's very, I don't want to say flippant because it's not, but you don't really dig into the meat and bones of it. I feel like we have, and I think it's been very productive because I think both from artists and maybe people who powers to be, understand the perspective of the employees a bit more and like how they're feeling during it, because every podcast I've spoken about this and every podcast I'm hearing slightly different flavors, but relatively the same tone. The communication, this is hard. And I think it's very productive because it's also a case of like, not everyone's alone on this, everyone's going through the same thing. And ways we can handle it and be aware of it, I think is very useful. But I appreciate taking the time. I feel sorry every time the LA crowd come on, I'm asking you to come on during your lunch break. I really appreciate it. And I mean, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a good chat.
Everyone listening, same as every week, like, share, follow, subscribe. The more the podcast gets shared, the more the people can learn and use the information that fantastic artists like Melissa have to share. But again, thank you so much, and I'll catch everyone next week.